Love did not keep the roof from caving in on a 400-year-old estate. Money did. Atlas Pendleton, the Duke of Rotherford, understood this with brutal clarity. He didn't want a wife. He wanted a bailout. So, when he met a quiet, sharp-witted woman with frayed ribbons on her gown, he did what any desperate man would do. He walked away. He dismissed her as a penniless nobody. It was the most expensive mistake of his life. The ballroom of the Duchess of Richmond smelled of wilting lilies, expensive wax, and quiet desperation. To the untrained eye, it was a glittering sea of silk and jewels, the pinnacle of the London season. To Atlas Pendleton, it was a meat market, and he was the prize cut, rapidly approaching his expiration date. Atlas stood near a towering marble pillar, a glass of warm champagne gripped loosely in his gloved hand. He was the 9th Duke of Rotherford. He owned 70,000 acres of prime English countryside, a sprawling ancestral home in Derbyshire, and a townhouse on Grosvenor Square. He was also drowning. His late father had possessed a profound passion for slow horses and fast women, leaving behind a mountain of debt so staggering it kept Atlas awake until dawn, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. He needed an heiress, £50,000 at minimum, just to appease the creditors threatening to seize the Derbyshire estate. "You look like a man calculating the drop from the nearest bridge," a voice murmured beside him. Atlas blinked, pulling his gaze from the swirling dancers. The woman standing beside him was entirely unremarkable at first glance. Her gown was a muted dove grey, entirely devoid of the lace and pearls that adorned the other women. Her hair, a deep shade of chestnut, was pinned back severely. "I was actually calculating the cost of the candles in those chandeliers," Atlas replied, surprising himself with his honesty. "A terrible waste of beeswax, considering half the room is too intoxicated to see them." The woman let out a short, sharp laugh. It wasn't a delicate, practiced giggle. It was a real laugh. 72 candles per fixture. 5 fixtures. At £1 a pound, Her Grace is burning through a minor fortune just to ensure Lord Higgins can see his cards at the whist table. Atlas turned to look at her properly. She was looking back at him, her dark eyes holding the tired patience of a woman who found the entire world fundamentally exhausting. "I am Rotherford," he said, extending a slight bow. "Catherine Harlow," she replied. She did not curtsy. She merely nodded. They stood together in the periphery of the madness. For the first time in 3 weeks, the tight coil of anxiety in Atlas's chest loosened. Catherine didn't flutter her eyelashes. She didn't ask him about his lands. She just stood beside him and offered a running, ruthless commentary on the guests. She was observant. She was sharp. She possessed a dry, cynical wit that perfectly matched his own grim mood. When the orchestra struck up a waltz, Atlas didn't think. He offered his hand. "Miss Harlow, save me from another hour of standing against this pillar." She hesitated, her eyes flickering down to his outstretched hand, then took it. As they stepped onto the floor, the magic of their quiet corner dissolved into the harsh light of reality. Up close, under the glare of the costly chandeliers, Atlas noticed the details. The fabric of her dress was heavy, but cheap. Her gloves had been meticulously mended at the thumb. The ribbon tied around her waist was slightly frayed at the edges. The cold, pragmatic machinery of his mind engaged. Miss Catherine Harlow. He had never heard the name. No prominent family. No whispered rumors of a dowry. She was a nobody. A poor relation, perhaps, brought along out of charity. She was clever, she was grounding, and she felt right in his arms. But she was a liability. He couldn't afford her. He couldn't even afford the carriage ride to court her. When the music ended, the warmth between them had cooled. Atlas led her back to the edge of the room. His posture was rigid. "Thank you for the dance, Miss Harlow," he said, his voice clipped. Catherine looked at him, the amusement gone from her eyes. She saw the shift. She saw him look at her mended glove. "Of course, Your Grace. Duty calls, I'm sure." Atlas turned and walked away. He needed a drink. He found his closest friend, Lord Thomas, lingering by the punch bowl. "Who was the little grey mouse?" Thomas asked, amused. "Not your usual type, Rothford, or has desperation finally lowered your standards?" Atlas swallowed a glass of punch, the cheap brandy burning his throat. The guilt pricked at him, so he buried it under cruelty. "She is a pleasant enough creature, but she hasn't a pot to piss in, Thomas. I need a Duchess who brings gold, not mended gloves. I cannot afford to look twice at a woman like that." He turned to set his glass down. Catherine Harlow was standing 2 feet away, partially obscured by a heavy velvet drape. She had come to fetch her shawl. Her face was perfectly blank. She didn't flush. She didn't cry. She simply met Atlas's eyes for one long, devastating second. Then she turned and walked out into the London night. 3 days later, Atlas sat in a velvet-lined carriage opposite Lady Caroline Danvers. Lady Caroline was blonde, beautiful, and possessed a dowry of £75,000. She was also, Atlas was rapidly discovering, completely vacant. "And then my pug, little Barnaby, absolutely refused to eat his lamb liver," Caroline chirped, her fan fluttering like a dying bird. "I told the cook, I said, Barnaby requires only the finest veal. Don't you agree, Your Grace?" "Fascinating," Atlas said, staring out the carriage window. His head was throbbing. He felt entirely hollow. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Catherine's face behind the velvet drape. He saw the cold, dead way she had looked at him. He had done what was necessary. He was securing his family's future. Yet he felt like a monster. The carriage rolled to a stop near the Serpentine in Hyde Park. Atlas stepped out to assist Lady Caroline. As he turned, he saw her. Catherine was walking along the gravel path, accompanied by an older woman in severe black. Catherine wore the same grey pelisse, the same sensible scuffed boots. Atlas froze. He instinctively took a step toward her, his hand raising to tip his hat. Catherine's gaze slid over him. It didn't catch. It didn't falter. She looked at him with the precise level of interest one reserves for a lamp-post. She walked past him without breaking her stride. The cut direct. The ultimate societal snub, delivered by a woman in a mended dress to a duke. Atlas stood rooted to the spot, his face burning, as Lady Caroline prattled on about the swans. Across the city, far from the manicured lawns of Hyde Park, the air grew thick with coal smoke and the scent of the Thames at low tide. This was the city of London, the beating, ruthless heart of the Empire's wealth. Catherine stepped out of a hired hackney cab and walked into a towering stone building on Lombard Street. She didn't bother using the side entrance. She walked straight through the heavy oak doors, past the tellers counting stacks of notes, and up a narrow, dimly lit staircase. She opened the frosted glass door at the top. The gold lettering read, J. Harlow and Cowembert Shipping and Investments. Inside, a dozen clerks scratched frantically at ledgers. At the sight of her, the scratching stopped. Every man in the room stood up. "Good morning, gentlemen," Catherine said, her voice crisp. She stripped off the cheap, mended gloves and tossed them into a waste bin. She walked into the spacious inner office. Behind a massive mahogany desk sat Mr. Harding, a man whose face was a map of stress lines. He scrambled out of his leather chair. "Miss Harlow, I wasn't expecting you today. I had an opening in my social calendar," Catherine said dryly, taking the seat he vacated. She pulled a stack of heavy ledgers toward her. Catherine Harlow was not a poor relation. She was the sole, uncontested heir to Jonathan Harlow, a man who had built a fleet of merchant ships from nothing and bought up half the railways in the north. He had raised her on docks and in counting houses. When he died 2 years ago, he left her a fortune that made the Duke of Rothford's debts look like pocket change. She dressed poorly by design. She hated the sycophants, the fortune hunters, the titled lords with empty heads and empty pockets, who thought a woman's money was theirs by divine right. She wanted to exist quietly. "The East India shares?" Catherine asked, opening the first ledger. "Sold exactly as you instructed. A 40% profit," Harding reported, hovering nervously. "And the new docks in Liverpool are fully funded. Good." Catherine turned a page. Her eyes scanned the columns of numbers, finding comfort in their absolute logic. Numbers didn't lie. Numbers didn't invite you to dance and then call you a beggar behind a curtain. "There is one matter, Miss Harlow," Harding said, clearing his throat. "The Rothford debt." Catherine's pen paused over the paper. A drop of black ink pooled on the page. "Coates Bank is looking to offload the mortgages on the Rothford country estate," Harding explained. "They are over-leveraged. The Duke is drowning. The bank wants to sell the paper to a private syndicate to recoup their cash. It's a solid asset. The land is good, even if the current Duke is entirely out of funds." Catherine leaned back in the heavy leather chair. She looked out the window, watching the smog roll over the rooftops of London. She thought of Atlas Pendleton's aristocratic jawline. She thought of his cold, calculating eyes. I need a Duchess who brings gold, not mended gloves." A slow, icy calm settled over her. She didn't want revenge. Revenge was petty. But a harsh lesson in economics? That was simply good business. "Buy it," Catherine said. "Just a portion to spread the risk?" Harding asked. "No." Catherine looked back at her solicitor, her eyes hard. "Buy all of it. Buy the estate mortgages. Buy the Grosvenor Square promissory notes. Consolidate every shilling of debt that man owes under our holding company." Harding blinked. "That will cost upward of £80,000 in liquid capital, Miss Harlow. If he defaults, he will default," Catherine said flatly. "And when he does, the Duke of Rothford will belong to me." The rain was relentless, turning the streets of London into a thick, grey stew. Atlas sat in his study, a glass of whiskey untouched on his desk. Before him lay a single sheet of heavy parchment, delivered by a messenger an hour ago. It was a formal notice of consolidated debt. His bank, Coates, had sold him out. Every mortgage, every line of credit, every embarrassing marker his father had left behind had been bought up by a single entity. The Northern Syndicate. The grace period he had spent months begging for was gone. The new creditors were calling the debt in. He had exactly 7 days to produce £50,000, or they would foreclose on the Derbyshire estate. It was over. 300 years of Pendleton history, wiped out by a single ledger entry. "I need the carriage," Atlas barked, striding out into the hallway. An hour later, soaked and shivering beneath his heavy wool coat, Atlas stood in Lombard Street. He had tracked the address of the Northern Syndicate to a building shared by J. Harlow and Coby. He didn't care about the mud ruining his Hessians. He was a man marching to his execution, hoping to negotiate with the hangman. He was directed up a narrow staircase by a terrified-looking clerk. "The principal is in the main office, Your Grace. They are expecting you." Atlas gripped the brass handle of the frosted glass door. He braced himself. He expected a fat, ruthless baron of industry, a man who chewed cigars and spat on the floor, a man who would relish bringing a duke to his knees. Atlas pushed the door open. The office was vast, smelling of rich leather and lemon polish. A fire crackled in the hearth. Behind a massive desk, illuminated by the grey light of the window, sat a figure going over a stack of documents. I am Rothford, Atlas said, his voice loud, carrying the last shreds of his aristocratic authority. I demand to speak to the principal of this syndicate. The figure behind the desk sighed, carefully placed a brass paperweight onto the documents, and looked up. Atlas's breath stopped in his chest. His heart gave one violent, painful thud against his ribs. It was Catherine. She was not wearing a faded muslin dress today. She wore a tailored riding habit of deep navy wool, cut with an expensive severity that screamed power. The frayed ribbons were gone. In their place, a simple, blindingly expensive diamond pin rested at her throat. She looked at him. There was no surprise in her eyes. There was only the cold, steady gaze of a predator who had finally trapped its prey. Sit down, Your Grace, Catherine said. Her voice was exactly the same as it had been in the ballroom. Quiet, grounded, utterly unimpressed. Atlas didn't move. The room was spinning. He looked from her face to the ledgers on the desk, to the heavy iron safe in the corner. His mind scrambled to make sense of the impossible geometry of the situation. Miss Harlow, he managed, the words scraping out of his throat. What are you doing here? Where is the owner of this firm? I am the owner of this firm, Catherine said, leaning back in her chair. She steepled her fingers together. J. Harlow was my father. The Northern Syndicate is a holding company I use for private acquisitions. Acquisitions like you. Atlas felt the blood drain from his face. He reached out and gripped the back of the leather chair to keep from collapsing. The girl in the mended gloves, the woman he had discarded because she couldn't afford a carriage. You bought my debt, he whispered. I bought all of it, Catherine confirmed, picking up the same pen she had used to seal his fate. You owe me £82,416, Duke, plus interest. This is a joke, a petty, theatrical joke. Atlas's shock was rapidly curdling into anger. He stepped forward, slamming his hands down on her desk. You did this because of what I said at the Richmond ball? Because I bruised your pride? Catherine didn't flinch. She simply looked at his hands, then up to his eyes. Do not flatter yourself, Rothford, she said softly, but the words cut like glass. I do not spend £80,000 on hurt feelings. I bought your debt because it is a highly lucrative asset. Your land is fertile, your tenant farms are well managed, and you are hopelessly incompetent at leveraging them. When I foreclose on Derbyshire next week, I will strip the estate, sell the timber, and double my investment in 5 years. Atlas stared at her. The air in the room was suffocating. She meant it. She wasn't playing a game. She was going to ruin him, and she was going to do it with the same emotional detachment with which she drank cheap punch. You cannot do this, he said, his voice cracking. The aristocratic armor was gone. He was just a terrified man. My mother lives in that house. It is all we have. Then you should have managed your books better, Catherine said. She pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward her. Now, unless you have £82,000 in your coat pocket, we have nothing further to discuss. The solicitors will contact you on Monday. She looked down at her papers. The dismissal was absolute. Atlas stood there, the silence ringing in his ears. He realized, with a sickening drop in his stomach, that he had entirely misread the world. He had thought he was the one making the rules. He had thought he was the one who could afford to throw people away. He turned slowly and walked towards the door. His hand rested on the handle. Miss Harlow, he said quietly, not looking back. Yes, Your Grace. I was wrong about you, Atlas said, the bitter taste of absolute defeat in his mouth. You are not a liability at all. He walked out into the rain, leaving the woman he had dismissed to rule over the ashes of his empire. The Grosvenor Square house felt different when you knew you no longer owned it. Atlas walked through the front doors, handing his soaked coat to his ancient butler. Bates. The man's livery was threadbare at the cuffs. The grand chandelier in the foyer held only a dozen candles, spaced out to give the illusion of light, while casting long, hollow shadows against the peeling silk wallpaper. Atlas's boots clicked loudly on the marble. It was the sound of a hollowed-out legacy. He walked into the drawing-room. His mother, the Dowager Duchess of Rothford, sat close to a meagre coal fire, wrapped in a faded cashmere shawl. She was reading a book of sermons, her spectacles slipping down her thin nose. "You are soaked, Atlas," she said without looking up. "Ring for Bates to bring you hot tea. Bates is asleep on his feet, Mother, and we are out of the good tea," Atlas said, pouring himself a measure of brandy from a crystal decanter. It was the cheap stuff, harsh and burning. "In fact, we are out of everything." She finally lowered the book. Her eyes, the same piercing blue as his, narrowed. Did the Coots men refuse an extension? "Cutts no longer holds our paper. They sold it." Atlas sat heavily in a winged armchair, burying his face in his hands. The smell of wet wool and despair clung to him. "A private syndicate bought it. They are calling in the debt. All of it. By next week." The book slipped from his mother's lap, hitting the Persian rug with a dull thud. For a moment, the rigid, aristocratic mask she had worn for 60 years slipped, revealing the terrified old woman underneath. "Derbyshire. They can't take Derbyshire. Where will we go? The Dower House has a collapsed roof." Atlas looked at her. He saw the tremble in her frail hands. A sickening wave of nausea washed over him. This was his failure. His father had dug the hole, but Atlas had failed to climb out of it. He had spent his days at gentlemen's clubs, assuming his title would magically manifest a solution. "I will fix it," Atlas said. The words tasted like ash. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in his dark study, staring at the family crest carved into the oak mantelpiece. He laid out the facts like troops on a battlefield. Fact 1. Catherine Harlow possessed enough capital to buy him 10 times over. Fact 2. She despised him for his arrogance. Fact 3. She was a businesswoman, and businesswomen operated on profit, not emotion. By dawn, Atlas had his strategy. It was humiliating. It would make him the laughingstock of whites, but it was the only card he had left to play. At 10 o'clock, Atlas was back in Lombard Street. The clerks in J. Harlow & Kerman did not look terrified this time. They looked at him with the quiet, devastating pity reserved for bankrupts. He was ushered into Catherine's office. She was exactly where she had been yesterday, her dark hair pinned back, a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles resting on her nose as she read a shipping manifest. She didn't offer him a seat. "Duke," she said, not looking up. "If you are here to beg for an extension, my solicitor handles the whining. His office is down the hall." "I am not here to beg, Miss Harlow," Atlas said, stepping up to her desk. He kept his spine violently straight. "I am here to propose a merger." That made her stop. Catherine slowly lowered the manifest. She took off her spectacles, her dark eyes pinning him to the spot. "A merger. Between my £80,000 of liquid capital and your £80,000 of catastrophic debt? The math does not favour you, Rothford. I am a duke," Atlas said, his voice flat. He was stripping himself naked, piece by piece, laying his only remaining value on her mahogany desk. "You are the daughter of a merchant. You have more money than God, but you cannot buy your way into the House of Lords. You cannot buy a seat at the tables where the railway legislation is written. Your ships face crippling tariffs because you have no political leverage." Catherine tilted her head. The hostility in her eyes shifted, fractionally, into calculation. She didn't interrupt. "You need a peer," Atlas continued, pressing the advantage. "A high-ranking peer. Someone who can walk into Parliament and block the canal bills that threaten your freight lines. Someone who can legitimize your syndicate in the eyes of the Crown. And you are offering to be my lapdog in the House of Lords? She asked, a cruel smile touching the corner of her mouth. I am offering to be your husband. Atlas corrected. The word hung in the air, heavy and sharp. You clear my debts. You secure Derbyshire in a trust for my mother's lifetime. In exchange, I give you my name, my title, and my proxy in Parliament. You become Her Grace, the Duchess of Rothford. The doors that are currently slammed in the face of J. Harlow incumbent will be held open for you. Silence descended on the office. Outside, the muffled shouts of street vendors drifted through the thick glass. Catherine picked up her brass paperweight, turning it over in her hands. She looked at Atlas, really looked at him. She saw the dark circles under his eyes, the rigid clench of his jaw, the sheer desperate pride keeping him upright. She had intended to crush him. It was clean. It was profitable. But what he was offering? He wasn't wrong. The canal lobbyists were choking her northern expansion. A duke's influence was a weapon she desperately needed, but one she could never purchase outright. Until now. You stood in a ballroom, Catherine said quietly, her voice devoid of its usual sharp edge, and told your friend I wasn't worth a second look because I couldn't bring you gold. You dismissed me as a mouse. Atlas held her gaze. He didn't flinch. I was a fool, a desperate, terrified fool who couldn't see past a frayed ribbon. I am paying for that arrogance now, Miss Harlow. I am standing before you, entirely at your mercy, offering to sell myself to the mouse. Catherine placed the paperweight down with a definitive click. Return at noon tomorrow with your solicitor, she said. We will draft the contract. The negotiation did not take place in a drawing room over tea. It took place in a sterile conference room at Catherine's bank, smelling of ink and old paper. Atlas sat on one side of the long oak table, flanked by his sputtering, red-faced solicitor, Mr. Phipps. Catherine sat opposite him, accompanied by the perpetually stressed Mr. Harding. This is an outrage. Phipps slapped a heavily redacted document onto the table. These terms are unprecedented. The Duke of Rothford cannot be put on a quarterly allowance like a schoolboy. The Duke of Rothford, Catherine said smoothly, not looking up from her tea, has demonstrated a profound inability to manage his own finances. If I am absorbing £80,000 of his liabilities, I will not allow him access to my capital to fund further disastrous wages at Newmarket. Atlas stared at the contract. Clause 4. The husband waives all legal right to the wife's dowry, current assets, and future business profits. In the eyes of English law, a woman's wealth became her husband's upon marriage. Catherine was dismantling centuries of common law with a single stroke of her pen. She is castrating your authority, Your Grace. Phipps hissed in Atlas's ear. Atlas looked across the table. Catherine wore a severe black dress, a stark contrast to the pale skin of her throat. She looked utterly bored. She wasn't doing this to humiliate him. She was doing it to protect her empire. He couldn't even blame her. If the roles were reversed, he would do the same. I will accept the allowance, Atlas said loudly, silencing Phipps. 5,000 a year. 2,000, Catherine countered instantly. And you will resign your membership from White's. I will not fund your gambling. Atlas's jaw tightened. 3,000, and I keep my clubs. I cannot lobby Parliament on your behalf if I am not seen socializing with the men who write the laws. Catherine considered this. She gave a curt nod. Agreed. Regarding Derbyshire. Atlas pressed, leaning forward. The estate remains in my family line. You do not sell the timber. You do not strip the house. The estate will be placed into an unbreakable trust, Catherine replied, sliding a secondary document across the table. It will be managed by my firm. Your mother may reside there until her passing, at which point it becomes a working agricultural asset under my supervision. The title will pass to our heir. Should we fail to produce one, the estate defaults to my holding company upon your death." Atlas stared at the word heir. A cold prickle ran down his spine. In all his desperate calculations, he had viewed this strictly as a business transaction. But a dukedom required an heir, which meant they would have to. He looked at Catherine. She was staring steadfastly at her paperwork, but a faint, betraying flush had crept up her neck. She too had realized the biological requirement of their contract. "I will sign," Atlas said, his voice rough. He pulled the heavy parchment toward him, dipped a quill in ink, and signed his life away. He was no longer the master of his own fate. He was an asset in the portfolio of J. Harlow & Co. 2 weeks later, the engagement was announced in the Times. The backlash was immediate and vicious. The Tun thrived on blood in the water, and the Duke of Rothford had practically severed an artery. He was marrying a Stew, a merchant's daughter, a nobody who smelled of coal smoke and ledgers. The true test came at the Duchess of Richmond's closing ball of the season. Atlas stood at the entrance to the ballroom, Catherine's hand resting lightly on his arm. She wore a gown of midnight blue silk. It wasn't frilly or over-decorated. It was sleek, brutally expensive, and fit her perfectly. Around her neck sat a sapphire the size of a quail's egg. It was a silent, deafening statement. "I bought him, and I can afford it." They stepped into the room. The music didn't stop, but the conversation did. A ripple of whispers chased them as they walked down the grand staircase. "Keep your chin up," Atlas murmured, his hand covering hers where it rested on his forearm. "I have faced down striking dock workers in Liverpool, Rothford," Catherine replied, her voice cool. "A room full of inbred aristocrats with bad teeth does not frighten me. They were intercepted near the Punch Bowl by Lady Caroline Danvers." The blonde heiress looked Atlas up and down with exaggerated pity, then turned a patronizing smile on Catherine. "Miss Harlow, or I suppose soon to be your Grace," Caroline cooed. "We were all so shocked by the news. It is so very modern of the Duke to look past one's breeding. Tell me, do you plan to install a steam engine in the Grosvenor drawing room?" A few onlookers tittered behind their fans. Atlas stiffened. The instinct to smooth things over, to play the polite aristocrat, warred with a sudden violent urge to throw Lady Caroline's punch in her face. Before Atlas could speak, Catherine tilted her head. She looked at Caroline with the same dead-eyed assessment she had given Atlas's ledgers. "No, Lady Caroline," Catherine said smoothly, "but I do plan to review the mortgages my firm currently holds on your father's estates in Sussex. Given his recent losses at cards, a steam engine might be the only way to generate enough capital to prevent me from foreclosing by Christmas." The colour drained from Caroline's face so fast she looked like a wax figure. The titters in the crowd died instantly. Catherine smiled, a terrifying, bloodless smile. "Do enjoy the punch." She turned and walked away, pulling Atlas with her. Atlas followed her into the hallway, his heart hammering. When they were out of earshot, he let out a sharp, breathless laugh. Catherine stopped and looked at him, her eyebrows raised. "That," Atlas said, shaking his head, "was the most ruthlessly efficient social slaughter I have ever witnessed." "She was being tedious," Catherine said, adjusting her gloves. "I do not have time for tedious people." Atlas looked down at her. Beneath the ice he saw the slight tremor in her hands. She was putting up a massive front. She was swimming with sharks, armed only with her checkbook and her pride. For the first time since he met her, Atlas didn't see a creditor or a liability. He saw a partner. "Come," Atlas said, offering his arm again, his tone softening. Let us go drink Her Grace's expensive champagne. You've earned it." The wedding took place on a Tuesday morning at St. George's, Hanover Square. It rained. There were no flowers. There were no bridesmaids. The only attendees were Atlas's mother, looking deeply medicated, and Mr. Harding, who clutched a briefcase as if he expected someone to steal it. Atlas stood at the altar in his formal charcoal morning coat. When Catherine walked down the aisle, she wore a simple ivory dress and no veil. She looked like a woman marching to the gallows. Atlas felt a heavy stone settle in his stomach. He was doing this to her. He was trapping this brilliant, fiercely independent woman in a cage of social expectation just to save his own skin. He took her hand. It was freezing. "I, Atlas, take thee, Catherine." The vows sounded like a threat. They signed the registry in silence. When the vicar prompted Atlas to kiss his bride, he leaned in and pressed his lips rigidly to her cheek. She smelled of lavender and anxiety. An hour later, they were in a carriage heading to the Grosvenor Square house. Catherine had insisted they live there. "It is the seat of the Duke. It projects stability," she had said during negotiations. "I will pay for the upkeep." The carriage ride was suffocatingly quiet. Atlas watched the rain slide down the glass. "You are quiet," Catherine noted, staring straight ahead. "I was merely calculating the odds of us surviving the next 50 years without murdering each other." Atlas replied dryly. "I am a pragmatist, Rothford. Murder is messy and the legal fees are exorbitant. I prefer to ignore things that displease me." The carriage pulled to a stop. Bates opened the door, an umbrella trembling in his hand. "Welcome home, Your Grace. Welcome, Your Grace." Catherine stepped into the massive foyer. She looked up at the peeling wallpaper, the faded rugs, the general air of aristocratic decay. She didn't sneer. She simply assessed it. "I will have contractors here by Monday," she said, stripping off her gloves. "This house smells like damp and regret." "It smells like 300 years of history," Atlas argued, instinctively defensive. "History does not pay the heating bill." Catherine turned to Bates. "Have my trunks brought to the master suite. The Duke will take the adjoining room." Bates blinked, looking to Atlas for confirmation. Atlas gave a tight, humiliating nod. The day dragged on in a strange, stilted purgatory. They ate dinner at opposite ends of a mahogany table large enough to seat 30. The clinking of silver against porcelain echoed like gunshots. By midnight, the house was silent. Atlas was in the library, sitting in the dark with a glass of scotch. The fire had died down to embers. He was a married man. He was a kept man. He hated himself, and he hated the sprawling, empty house. A floorboard creaked. Atlas turned. The library door was open. Catherine stood in the doorway, holding a silver candlestick. She had stripped away the heavy silk and corsets. She wore a simple cotton dressing gown, her dark hair falling loose over her shoulders. Without the armor of her wealth, she looked small. She looked human. "I couldn't sleep," she said softly. "The ghosts of the Pendleton ancestors are notoriously loud," Atlas replied, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. Catherine walked into the room, placing the candle on a side table. She looked at the decanter, then at Atlas. "Pour me one." Atlas raised an eyebrow. "It is not tea, Catherine. It is scotch." "I know what it is. My father drank it when his ships went down. Pour it." Atlas stood, fetched a second glass, and poured a generous measure. He handed it to her. Their fingers brushed. The jolt of warmth was startling in the freezing room. Catherine took a sip, winced as the alcohol burned its way down, and then sighed. She sank into the leather sofa opposite him, pulling her knees up slightly. "You hate this," she said, staring into the embers. "I hate being powerless." Atlas corrected. sitting back down. "I'm a man accustomed to giving orders, not begging for allowances." "You think I enjoy this?" Catherine snapped, her head whipping toward him. The firelight caught the sudden flash of anger in her eyes. "You think I wanted to buy a husband? I wanted to run my ships. I wanted to build my railways. But every time I walked into a boardroom, men looked at me as if I were a dog walking on its hind legs. I had the money, but I was a joke. I had to chain myself to your rotting legacy just to be taken seriously." Her voice cracked on the last word. She took a deep, shaky breath, looking away. Atlas stared at her. He saw the bone-deep exhaustion she carried, the weight of her empire, the isolation of being a woman in a man's world. She was just like him, really, crushed by the expectations of the name she inherited. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. The cynical armor he wore melted away, leaving only quiet honesty. "I am sorry," Atlas said. Catherine looked back at him, guarded. "For what?" "For the ballroom. For treating you like a ledger entry today. For all of it." Atlas stared down at his hands. "You are right. I failed my family. I failed this estate. I dragged you into my mess to save myself. You didn't ruin me, Catherine. I was already ruined. You just caught me before I hit the ground." The silence that followed was different from the cold silences of the day. It was heavy, but it was fragile. Catherine set her glass down. She looked at Atlas, at the broad set of his shoulders beneath his rumpled shirt, at the genuine remorse in his eyes. "We are a terrible match, Rothford." She whispered. "The worst?" Atlas agreed, a small, sad smile touching his lips. "But we are the match we have." He stood up, picked up her candle, and held it out to her. "Go to sleep, Catherine. Tomorrow we rebuild the roof." She took the candle. For a fleeting second, she didn't move away. She stood close enough that he could smell the lavender soap on her skin. Then she turned and walked toward the door. "Good night, Atlas," she said softly, leaving him alone in the dark. Atlas watched her go, a strange, terrifying realization blooming in his chest. The war for the estate was over, but the war for his wife had just begun. The Grosvenor Square house smelled of plaster dust and turpentine for 6 straight weeks. Catherine was a woman of her word. 2 days after their bleak wedding, an army of contractors descended upon the property. They ripped out the rotting silk wallpaper, replaced the cracked marble in the foyer, and reinforced the sagging roof above the east wing. The noise was constant. The disruption was absolute. Atlas did not complain. He found a strange, grim satisfaction in the chaos. The house was being gutted, stripped down to its studs, and rebuilt. It felt like an uncomfortably accurate metaphor for his own life. He spent his days in the library, which had been spared the worst of the renovations. But he was not drinking scotch, and he was not hiding. The massive oak desk, once reserved for his father's sprawling collection of unpaid tailor's bills, was now buried under mountains of paper. Shipping manifests, tariff schedules, regional railway blueprints, parliamentary agendas. Atlas was learning the family business. If he was going to be a mercenary for J. Harlow & Cobos in the House of Lords, he refused to be an ignorant one. "Your Grace." Atlas looked up, rubbing his burning eyes. Bates stood in the doorway, holding a silver tray with a single, steaming cup. The butler's livery was entirely new, crisp, and flawlessly tailored. Catherine had outfitted the entire staff within her first week. "It is past 2 in the morning," Bates said, his voice carrying a gentle reproof. "Her Grace requested I bring you tea. She noted the light under your door." Atlas looked at the ceiling. Catherine's suite was directly above the library. She was awake, too. "Thank you, Bates. Leave it on the desk." He took a sip of the tea. It was a psalm, strong and perfectly brewed. He pulled the next document towards him. It was a drafted bill sponsored by Lord Harrington, a man whose family owned half the canals in the Midlands. The bill proposed a devastating tax on steam-powered freight-crossing county lines. It was a blatant, targeted attack on Catherine's Northern Railway expansion. Atlas picked up a pencil and began writing furious notes in the margins. He dismantled Harrington's arguments piece by piece, finding the legal loopholes, cross-referencing them with trade laws from the previous century. He worked until the pale, grey light of dawn crept through the windows. The dynamic between Atlas and Catherine had settled into a rhythm of exhausted, wary respect. They were two generals commanding a war from the same bunker. They ate breakfast together, surrounded by the noise of carpenters. They spoke in short, efficient bursts about stock prices, steel imports, and political leverage. There was no romance. There was no touching. But there was observation. Atlas noticed that Catherine rubbed her left temple when she was stressed, a telltale sign of the migraines she refused to admit she suffered. He noticed that she took her coffee black, but stared longingly at the sugar bowl before pushing it away, as if denying herself even the smallest indulgence. Catherine noticed things, too. She noticed that Atlas never touched a card. She noticed that when he spoke to her clerks at the Lombard Street office, he did so with the same deferential politeness he offered his peers. He did not treat her men like servants, he treated them like colleagues. The real test of their new alliance came on a Thursday evening at White's. Atlas had retained his membership per their contract. He rarely went, finding the atmosphere of cigar smoke and inherited arrogance suffocating after spending his days in the sharp, urgent reality of Catherine's world. But he needed to take the temperature of the room regarding the upcoming railway bill. He sat in a leather armchair near the fire, a newspaper open in his lap, nursing a glass of port. Rothford, good God, they let you out of the counting house. Atlas didn't lower his paper. He recognized the drawl. It was Lord Harrington, a heavy-set man with a ruddy complexion and a profound sense of his own importance. Harrington dropped into the chair opposite Atlas, signaling a waiter for a brandy. I must say we were taking bets on whether your new wife would allow you to keep your club membership, or does she dock your allowance if you stay out past 10? A few men sitting nearby chuckled softly, turning their attention to the confrontation. Atlas folded the newspaper with slow, deliberate precision. He placed it on the table beside him. He looked Harrington in the eye. My wife, Atlas said, his voice carrying the cold, quiet authority of centuries of breeding, is currently managing a fleet of 20 merchant vessels that docked in Liverpool this morning. She is a rather busy woman. She leaves my social calendar to my own discretion. Harrington sneered. Fascinating. Tell me, does she bring the smell of fish into the bedroom, or does the soot from her trains cover the scent? The silence in the room became absolute. It was a vile insult, crossing a line that even the most cynical aristocrats usually respected. Atlas did not shout. He did not challenge Harrington to a duel. Duels were for men who lacked the vocabulary to destroy an opponent. Instead, Atlas leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. I was reading over your proposed freight tax bill this morning, Harrington. Atlas said softly. The one designed to protect your canal interests. It is a very clever piece of legislation. Harrington blinked, thrown by the sudden shift in topic. It is necessary for the preservation of English trade. It is a desperate attempt to stop a hemorrhage. Atlas corrected, his tone conversational. Your canals are freezing in the winter and drying up in the summer. Your transport times are pathetic. You are losing shipping contracts to the railways at a rate of 20% a quarter. By my calculations, Harrington, if you don't pass this tax, your family will be bankrupt in 4 years. Harrington's ruddy face turned a pale, sickly shade of white. You don't know what you are talking about. I know, Atlas continued, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper that only Harrington and the closest eavesdroppers could hear. that you leveraged your estate in Sussex to buy more canal boats last spring. A terrible investment. The mortgages are currently held by the Bank of England. Do you know who buys distressed debt from the Bank of England for pennies on the pound, Harrington? Atlas smiled. It was a carbon copy of the smile Catherine had given Lady Caroline. Cold, bloodless, terrifying. My wife does, Atlas said softly. So before you inquire about the scent of my bedroom again, I suggest you consider whether you want to spend next Christmas living in a debtor's prison. Good evening to you. Atlas stood up, adjusted his cuffs, and walked out of the club. The story was all over London by noon the next day. The Duke of Rothford was not a kept lapdog. He was a guard dog, and he had teeth. November arrived in London with a vicious, biting cold. The sky was a perpetual sheet of bruised iron, and the damp seeped into the bones of the city. The vote on the Harrington freight bill was scheduled for the House of Lords on Friday. If it passed, it would cripple the Northern Syndicate's railway expansion, costing Catherine hundreds of thousands of pounds and stalling her empire for a decade. It was Wednesday night. The Grosvenor Square house was finally quiet, the renovations largely complete. The foyer smelled of fresh wax instead of dust. Atlas was in the library, standing by the fire, reviewing his notes for his speech to the Lords. He had memorized the trade statistics, the projected revenue losses, the legal precedents. He was ready. The door opened. Catherine walked in. Atlas looked up and felt a sharp jolt of alarm in his chest. She looked terrible. Her skin was the color of old parchment, and dark, bruised circles hung beneath her eyes. She was holding a stack of ledgers, her knuckles white. She walked toward his desk, swayed slightly, and caught the edge of the mahogany wood to steady herself. Atlas was across the room in 3 strides. He took her by the elbow. Sit down. I am fine. She snapped, instinctively pulling away. The armor was up, brittle and cracking. I just received word from Harding. Harrington has bribed 3 of the pivotal swing votes, Lords Yaxley, Graves and Townsend. They are backing the canal tax. She dropped the ledgers onto the desk. They hit with a heavy, final thud. We don't have the votes, Atlas, she said. Her voice was thin. It lacked the usual iron. I can cover the losses for a year, maybe 2, but if the tax is permanent, I will have to shut down the Northern Line. Thousands of men will lose their jobs. The steel mills will stall. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. She was shivering. Atlas didn't look at the ledgers. He looked at his wife. He saw the sheer, crushing weight of holding the sky up by herself for years. Come here, he said quietly. He didn't give her a chance to argue. He placed a hand on the small of her back and guided her away from the desk, toward the heavy leather sofa by the fire. He gently pushed her down until she was sitting, then grabbed a thick wool blanket from the back of his armchair and draped it over her shoulders. I don't need a blanket, Rothford. I need a strategy. Catherine protested, though she pulled the wool tighter around herself. You need to stop fighting the entire world for 5 minutes, Atlas said. He knelt on the rug in front of her, so they were at eye level. You are freezing. You are exhausted, and you are not listening to me. Catherine looked down at him. Her dark eyes were wide, defensive. Listen to what? Yaxley is a coward, Atlas said, his voice steady, grounding her. Graves is an idiot, and Townsend owes me a favour from Oxford that he has never repaid. They are not Harrington's men. They are opportunists. I will speak to them tomorrow before the session begins. I will remind them that aligning with a sinking canal ship is terrible for their political health. Harrington offered them money, Atlas. Cash, and I will offer them the wrath of the Duke of Rothford. Atlas said simply, I am a peer of the realm. I belong to the same elite, insufferable club they do. I know how to threaten them in a language they understand. Let me do my job. Catherine stared at him. The firelight flickered across her face, softening the severe lines of her jaw. She was so used to being the smartest person in the room, the only one capable of solving the crisis. Trusting someone else, trusting a man she had essentially purchased, was terrifying. "You can really flip their votes?" she whispered. "Yes," Atlas said. He reached out and took her hand. It was ice cold. He didn't let go. He rubbed his thumb over her knuckles. "You built the tracks, Catherine. Let me clear the train path. You don't have to carry it all, not anymore." Catherine's breath hitched. The walls she had spent a lifetime building, the cold pragmatism, the cynical detachment, shuddered and cracked wide open. She looked at his hand holding hers. The warmth of his skin against hers was a shock to her system. She leaned forward. It wasn't a calculated movement, it was a surrender. She rested her forehead against his shoulder. Atlas froze for a fraction of a second. Then he let out a long breath, wrapped his arms around her, and pulled her off the edge of the sofa and onto the rug with him. He held her against his chest. She felt impossibly small beneath the wool blanket. He felt the rigid tension in her spine slowly, agonizingly, begin to melt. They stayed like that for a long time, listening to the crackle of the fire and the rain lashing against the windows. When Catherine finally lifted her head, she didn't pull away. She was inches from his face. The vulnerability in her eyes was entirely unmasked. There were no ledges between them now. There was no contract. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice barely a breath. "Why are you fighting so hard for my company? You have your allowance. You have your house. Because it is not your company anymore," Atlas said, his gaze dropping to her lips and then back up to her eyes. "It is ours. Because you are my wife, and because I have spent the last 3 months watching you, and I am entirely terrified by how much I admire you." Catherine's breath caught in her throat. Atlas reached up, his fingers brushing a stray lock of dark hair behind her ear. His touch was hesitant, waiting for her to pull away, waiting for the pragmatic businesswoman to reassert control. She didn't. Instead, Catherine reached up and gripped the lapels of his jacket, her hands trembling slightly, and pulled him down to her. The kiss was not hesitant. It was a collision. It was months of unspoken tension, of biting remarks and lingering glances across a massive dining table, finally snapping. Atlas's hands tangled in her hair, the blanket falling away as he pulled her flush against him. Catherine kissed him with the same fierce, uncompromising intensity she applied to everything else in her life. There was nothing polite or aristocratic about it. It was desperate. It was real. Atlas broke the kiss, breathing heavily, resting his forehead against hers. "Catherine," he murmured, his voice rough. "Shut up, Atlas," she whispered, her hands sliding from his lapels to his shoulders, pulling him back down. The fire burned low in the grate, casting long dancing shadows across the walls of the newly renovated library. The house was no longer empty. The ghosts of Atlas's ancestors were silent, thoroughly banished by the undeniable, pulsing life of the two people on the rug, finally claiming the marriage they had bought and paid for. The House of Lords was a cathedral of wood, leather, and immense, suffocating privilege. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax and the collective ego of 200 men who believed they owned the earth by divine right. Atlas stood at the dispatch box. He wore a stark black coat and an expression of terrifying calm. The chamber was packed. The Harrington freight bill was the final item on the docket. Lord Harrington had already spoken, delivering a blustering, patriotic defense of English canals, painting the railways as dirty, dangerous monstrosities driven by greedy northern merchants. He had looked directly at Atlas during his speech, a smug smile playing on his lips. Atlas did not smile back. He waited for the Lord Chancellor to recognize him. The Duke of Rothford, the Chancellor droned. Atlas adjusted the single sheet of paper in his hand. It wasn't a speech, it was a list of numbers Catherine had written out for him at dawn. He looked around the chamber. He saw Lords Yaxley, Graves, and Townsend sitting near the back, looking distinctly uncomfortable. Atlas had cornered them in the cloakroom an hour prior. He hadn't raised his voice. He had simply outlined, with lethal precision, how J. Harlow and Cumser could utterly destroy their individual financial portfolios by the end of the fiscal quarter, if they voted for the tax. "My lords," Atlas began. His voice carried effortlessly, ringing in the vaulted ceiling. He didn't use the flowery, impassioned rhetoric customary in the chamber. He used Catherine's weapon. He used logic. "We have heard a great deal today about tradition, about preserving the idyllic nature of our waterways. It is a lovely sentiment. It belongs in a poetry book, not in the economic policy of the British Empire." A murmur rippled through the benches. Atlas ignored it. "Lord Harrington claims this tax will save the canals. Let me provide the chamber with the actual arithmetic of his salvation." Atlas looked down at the paper. A shipment of coal from Newcastle to London via canal takes, on average, 14 days. It is subject to weather delays, freezing waters, and immense spoilage. The same shipment via the Northern Railway line arrives in 36 hours. The cost to the consumer is reduced by 40%. Atlas stepped away from the dispatch box, walking slowly along the front bench. "You cannot tax the future into submission, gentlemen. Industry is not a passing trend. It is the foundation of the next century. By passing this bill, you are not protecting English trade. You are choking it to death to spare the feelings of men who refuse to adapt." He stopped and stared directly at Harrington. "My wife," Atlas said, the words echoing loudly in the quiet chamber. He didn't hide from the connection. He wielded it like a broadsword. "My wife operates the most efficient shipping and rail conglomerate in this country. She employs 8,000 men. She moves the steel that builds our bridges and the coal that heats our cities. She does this while the men in this room debate the aesthetics of barges." Atlas turned back to face the Lord Chancellor. "I vote against this catastrophic piece of legislation, and I suggest anyone who values the economic survival of this nation does the same." He sat down. The vote was called. It wasn't even close. The Harrington freight bill was defeated by a staggering majority. Yaxley, Graves, and Townsend voted against it, looking pale and sweating profusely. Harrington sat in his seat, staring straight ahead, a ruined man. Atlas did not stay for the closing prayers. He walked out of the chamber, grabbed his coat, and hailed a hackney cab. He didn't direct the driver to Grosvenor Square. He went to Lombard Street. He didn't bother knocking on the frosted glass door of the inner office. He pushed it open. Catherine was standing by the window, looking out over the smog-filled streets. She spun around as he entered. The severe businesswoman mask was entirely gone. She looked terrified. "Well?" she demanded, her hands clutched tightly in front of her. Atlas walked across the room, stopping inches from her. He looked down into her dark, anxious eyes. He didn't say a word. He simply reached into his coat pocket, pulled out the copy of Harrington's bill, and tore it neatly in half. He dropped the pieces onto the floor. Catherine stared at the torn paper. A shuddering breath escaped her lips. She covered her mouth with her hand, a wet, raw sound catching in her throat. Atlas pulled her into his arms. She wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder, holding onto him with a desperate, crushing grip. He held her tight, breathing in the scent of her lavender soap and the ink from her ledgers. He had won the war. He had secured her empire. 3 months later, the spring thaw came to Derbyshire. The massive stone facade of the Rothford ancestral estate was bathed in pale sunlight. The scaffolding that had covered the West Wing for the past 2 months was finally coming down. The roof was repaired. The gardens, neglected for a decade, were being cleared by a team of 50 groundskeepers. Atlas stood on the terrace, watching the workmen haul away the timber. He heard the crunch of gravel behind him. Catherine walked out through the French doors. She was wearing a simple, light muslin dress, the heavy wool and dark colors of winter banished. Her hair was pulled back loosely, a few strands escaping in the breeze. She looked rested. She looked happy. She came to stand beside him, resting her hand on the stone balustrade. Harding sent the quarterly reports this morning," she said, looking out over the sprawling green lawns. "The new rail line is fully operational. Profits are up 22%. "Excellent," Atlas said. He turned to look at her. "Does that mean my allowance gets an increase?" Catherine laughed. It was the same short, sharp laugh he had heard in the ballroom a lifetime ago, but it held no cynicism now, only warmth. She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a folded piece of heavy parchment. She held it out to him. Atlas frowned, taking it. He recognized the heavy wax seal of J. Harlow & Co. He unfolded it. It was the master ledger of his debts. The £82,000 his father had squandered. The promissory notes, the mortgages, the consolidated ruin that had forced him to sell his life to her. At the bottom of the page, written in Catherine's sharp, precise handwriting in bold red ink, were 2 words: "Paid in full." Atlas stared at the document. The air caught in his lungs. He looked up at Catherine. "I don't understand," he said softly. The trust is dissolved," Catherine said, her voice steady, holding his gaze. "The estate is yours, Atlas. Unencumbered. Free and clear." Atlas shook his head. "Catherine, no. The contract stated—" "I don't care what the contract stated," she interrupted gently. She reached out and placed her hand over his, resting on the parchment. "You didn't just save my company in Parliament, Atlas. You stood in a room full of men who despise me, and you claimed me. You fought for me. You proved to me that I don't need a legal document to ensure you won't walk away." She stepped closer, sliding her hand up his arm to cup his jaw. Her thumb brushed against his cheekbone. "There are no debts between us anymore, Rothford," she whispered. "We are equals. We are partners. You are my husband, not my asset." Atlas looked at the red ink, then at the woman who had stripped him of his pride, only to help him rebuild his soul. The heavy, suffocating weight that had rested on his shoulders since the day his father died, finally, permanently, vanished. He dropped the parchment onto the stone terrace. The wind caught it, blowing it across the gravel, tumbling away into the gardens, lost and forgotten. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her flush against him, lifting her slightly off her feet. Catherine laughed, wrapping her arms around his neck as he kissed her. It was a kiss of absolute, unburdened freedom. Love had not kept the roof from caving in on the 400-year-old estate. Money had done that. But money was just metal and paper. It was cold. It was ruthless. It was the woman in the mended gloves who had saved the Duke. And it was the Duke who had finally learned how to be worthy of her. The contract is void, and the ledger is closed. Atlas and Catherine began as a brutal business transaction, a desperate Duke and a ruthless heiress trading titles for capital. They ended as equals, proving that real power isn't found in bank vaults or aristocratic ballrooms, but in the quiet, terrifying act of trusting someone else with your ruin. If you loved this journey from cold hostility to fierce devotion, hit the like button. Share this video with someone who appreciates a truly unapologetic heroine, and subscribe for more grounded, hard-hitting romance dramas. See you in the next story.